so glad to be here. It wasn't 2 years ago, it was last year. So last year, about this time, I had 32 hours of an intense moment in my life that produced the most amazing person I've ever encountered, and I'm so grateful that she's in my life. And that brings me to one of the things that I'd really like to talk about, and one of the things that I'm going to discuss today is the idea of identity. And my name is Wanuri Kahiu, and I'm a filmmaker. And I say I'm a filmmaker, not an African filmmaker, or an East African filmmaker, or a black female filmmaker, or a Kenyan filmmaker, because I'm a filmmaker. That's what I am. And I don't think that all these other definitions will tell you any more about myself than I want to tell stories. And I know sometimes this idea of being a storyteller has kind of been overused. The word storyteller has been overused. But I want to reclaim that word, and I want to embody it in the largest essence of itself. Because for me, being a storyteller has always been part of our tradition. And I'm going to use Africa in the huge African sense of it, and forgive me for that. Because, like I said earlier, Africa is not a country. But I'm going to use, in a larger sense, the idea of being an African storyteller. Now, for me, and given where I've come from, a storyteller is not only the ability to tell stories. A storyteller is also the ability, in my tradition, to be a seer. So you could predict the future. You could say things were going to happen through stories. You could have a whole person's personal history told through stories. You could tell them where they've been, who their grandfather was, where they came from. Even the names themselves will tell a story about the person. That is being a storyteller. It's not only the ability to communicate an idea that becomes a film, that becomes a science fiction film, or anything like that. It's the ability to just be yourself. We wear our stories. Our stories are in the print. In the clothes that we create, the print itself means something. In Kenya and in Tanzania, the kanga, or the leso, has printed words at the bottom. And depending on how you wear that leso, if you wear it back to front, you're saying something to the person who's around you, or you're saying something about the country or the state of mind that you're in. And that, for me, is wearing your story. The way we're named. We're named for our ancestors. We have a strong belief in where we come from and where we're going. So we're named for that reason, to be able to carry your name as a story. To tell people where you come from, where you're going to, and to be able to link to the heritage that you are. Now, when I was in university, I was asked to tick boxes, and I'm sure all of us have done it, in some form or another, where you are asked to write your name, your sex, and then a huge paragraph of different definitions that you are. So I was in UCLA at the time, and I was asked to define whether I was Black, African American, Hispanic, Caucasian, what. And going down that list, there wasn't a box for African, and I wasn't sure whether or not to tick Black or other. So I ticked other. And that was the first time that I had actually encountered other people trying to define who I am in a box. And then I went home, and I've been home for a long time now. But we had a terrible moment of post-election violence in 2007, 2008. And as a result of that, people started asking you, where do you come from? And they weren't really asking where you came from. They were trying to determine what your ethnicity was, what your tribe was, so that they can try and figure out how to forge alliances with you. And at that point, I stopped saying my nation, and I started saying I am Kenyan. So when I would be asked, where do you come from? I come from Kenya. But yes, but where do you really come from? Kenya. But who are you? I'm a Kenyan. And that's as far as it went. And the consensus didn't like that very much. But that's as far as I could go with that conversation. And that was the other time that I had to then redefine who I am and put it into a very specific box and call it that. And I thought maybe by being a filmmaker and being a storyteller, I would escape this to a certain extent. I would be able to imagine and create worlds that I have never seen before in my life, that I want to be able to play in, that I think that is my representation of heaven. And that's what a filmmaker friend of mine would say, Jan Hendrik. He would say, when I think of heaven, whether you're religious or not, but when I think of heaven, I want to be able to say, watch my film. And that's what I want to be able to do. I want to create a utopia through my films. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're all really like beautiful and fancy. Sometimes they are gritty. But what I like to concentrate on are the human relationships in them. And I believe that the human relationships in them are beautiful. We were told about romantic love and the reasons that we have romantic love. So currently I'm writing a love story because I believe that we lack enough love stories coming out of Africa. And that's because most of the times love is depicted as something that is either brutal, and the men are depicted as people who are violent or are authoritative, and that hasn't been my experience. That has never been my experience. I've been in love. I am in love. And I am so grateful for it. And I'm so grateful for the people who I surround myself with who create this love, because my family is my nation. And I believe strongly in creating this family and this nation. But back to what I was saying. So I thought that maybe I'd escape these ideas and identities by creating. And so I created and I created and I created. And I made a science fiction film. That was my last film. And it's called Pumzi, just in case you want to check it out. Do it. But in the film, it's about a young girl who lives in the future, and she wants to, above all, to nourish this plant. And she escapes the inside world that she's in, and she escapes into the outside world that's forbidden to try and save this plant. And my story about that was the ability or the need for us to nurture Mother Nature. The need for us to be mothers of things that we do not feel necessarily instantly connected to. And that's nature. And that's the bees, and that's the birds, and that's the flowers. We need to be able to connect to those, and we need to be able to nurture them, because this is the world that we live in, and this is the world that feeds us. And if we're not feeding the world that feeds us, and instead we're feeding concrete, there is nothing we will be leaving behind, and there's nothing we will be able to say about ourselves as a generation of people. And when I created this film, granted, it was made for my nieces and nephews. I wasn't a mother at that point, but it was made for my nieces and nephews. And granted, those were the people that I wanted to be able to tell the story to. But I also knew that if it traveled, that story wouldn't be necessarily unique. And I don't consider myself unique, because I know that anything that I laugh at, anything that I cry about, anything that motivates me will motivate at least 100,000 people somewhere else in the world. I am not that unique. I am not so unique that this little joke that I tell will only be understood by me. I'm not that unique. I'm not that special. So when I told this story for my nieces and nephews, I hoped that it would resonate with other people as well. But part of my journey has been, first, saying that science fiction is not weird in Africa. It is not special. It is not curious. It's not an original thing. We have always been telling stories. And in our stories, even as oral storytellers, we have used nature in our stories. We have talked of animals. We have talked about the ability of organic sciences in our stories. In our stories, we have had fantasies. We have had myths. In our own legends about our own self-creation, those things have existed. But Recently, there's been a phenomenon of labeling things Afro this or Afro that or Afro what. And one of those things that happened is my work started being labeled as Afrofuturist, and I appreciate the idea of Afrofuturism because it brings together or draws attention to works and pieces of art that have either some sort of fictitious let's say some sort of fictitious, or they bring in ideas of myths, science fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, and they envelope them into one. But my concern is that by labeling my work as an Afrofuturist work, it means that it's very specific to people of the diaspora, or people who are Black, or people who are Afro something. And that concerns me, because the story that I told was motivated by the very idea that I hate bottled water. I hate the fact that you have to buy water. And I remember saying this once, and people said I was weird for it. But I hate the idea that we have to buy natural resources, because what is the end of that? When will we start buying air? Actually, we have started buying air. There are oxygen bars all around the world, but that's another note. But where does this end? Where does the idea of buying natural things end? And that's the reason I really created Pumzi. And when we ourselves start labeling ourselves Afro this or Afro that, when it doesn't matter what we do as an artist or as whatever you do, if you're from Africa or if you're a person of the diaspora, you will immediately get that anyway. It doesn't matter if I stood here and I said I'm a filmmaker. There will be people who leave this audience and say, oh, do you remember that Black filmmaker from Kenya? You know the one, the chick? That's what will happen, whether I want it to happen or not. These are the things that will be imposed on us. So instead of us labeling ourselves and making it even more specific and segregating ourselves from the whole human experience, I urge you to think wider than that and to have less labels and maybe just to be. Just to be. Because for me, the idea that science fiction has always existed and to be a storyteller is for me. And it's for me in such a way that my ancestry, my clan, the clan I descend from, have said to be people who talk to nature and who talk to animals. If that's not science fiction in its essence, I don't know what is. So to say that it's weird, there is no place for that. Maybe there's more communication now, and we're able to hear these stories than we were before, but there is no place to say that it's weird, and there's no place to label it, because now I'd have to go back to what my mother used to tell me, the stories about, Wanuri, if you really, really want to grow hair, you should eat pumpkins. I don't eat pumpkins. And then if you really, really want to grow big breasts, you should attach leeches to your nipples. No leeches. And those kind of stories. And because she was a doctor, she's a pediatrician, and because she told stories, some of her stories had a mix of science in them, so they were science fiction in themselves. I cannot say that it hasn't existed. I am just a continuation of storytelling from that generation. But I want to say that the only reason that I would proudly wear the mantle of an Afrofuturist or an Afrofuturist anything is in the sense of being a mother. Because every day I imagine what kind of world my daughter is going to grow up in. And every day I seek to better the kind of world that she will be in and the kind of Africa that I will leave behind. And the ideas that I will create so that she is abundant and she is greater than I could ever be. And so that she is limitless in her ability to do anything that she wants to do. So that she is truly imagining a greater future for herself and a greater future for anybody else she leaves behind. So I urge you, consider your nature as part of your everyday thing, because that is the future. That is the only way we can be futurists. We can be Afrofuturists. We can be Eurofuturists. We can be Aussie futurists. We can be Asia futurists, is by creating the world that we will leave behind. And hopefully, in creating that world, one day when you see my daughter, in the same way that a prophet once saw Rumi walking down a path with his father, they will be able to say about her, behold, there goes an ocean walking behind a lake. Thank you very much.